The summer of 1839 descended upon New Orleans like a suffocating shroud, trapping the city in a humid embrace that made even the wealthy plantation owners retreat to their shaded verandas. In the French Quarter, the cobblestone streets radiated heat that could be felt through the thickest boots, and the air hung heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with the less pleasant odors of human sweat and desperation. Mary Delacroix stood in the kitchen of the Beauregard mansion, her dark skin glistening with perspiration as she prepared the evening meal for her masters. At 23, she possessed a beauty that was both blessing and curse. High cheekbones that caught the lamplight, eyes the color of rich coffee that seemed to hold secrets, and a figure that drew unwanted attention from every man who laid eyes upon her. "Mary, bring the wine to the dining room," commanded Madame Beauregard, her voice sharp with the authority of someone who had never known a day without servants. The woman's pale face was flushed from the heat and too much afternoon sherry, her elaborate dress wilting in the oppressive temperature. As Mary carried the crystal decanter through the mansion's ornate hallways, she could hear the voices of the dinner guests, wealthy plantation owners, merchants, and politicians who gathered regularly to discuss business and politics, while their slaves served them in silence. Tonight's conversation centered on the recent slave uprising rumors that had been circulating through the city like wildfire. "I tell you, we need to be more vigilant," declared Colonel Thibodeau, a portly man whose plantation lay just outside the city. "These Negroes are getting ideas above their station. Just last week, I had to make an example of one of my field hands who dared to look me in the eye." Mary's jaw tightened as she poured wine into the crystal glasses, her movements graceful and controlled, despite the rage building inside her chest. She had learned long ago to mask her emotions, to become invisible while remaining in plain sight. "Perhaps," suggested Dr. Rousseau, a thin man with calculating eyes, "we should consider the methods they use in Haiti. Fear is the most effective tool for maintaining order." The conversation continued as Mary retreated to the kitchen, but their words echoed in her mind. She had heard whispers of Haiti, of slaves who had risen up and claimed their freedom through blood and fire. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. Later that evening, as the guests departed and the household settled into sleep, Mary made her way to the small room she shared with two other house slaves. But instead of seeking rest, she slipped out through the servants' entrance and into the sultry New Orleans night, the French Quarter transformed after dark. Gas lamps cast dancing shadows on the wrought-iron balconies, and the sound of distant music drifted from the taverns and brothels that catered to sailors and merchants. Mary pulled her shawl over her head and made her way through the narrow streets, her destination a small shop tucked away in a forgotten alley. Mama Brigitte's shop was known throughout the slave community as a place where one could find remedies for both physical and spiritual ailments. The elderly woman who ran it was rumored to be a powerful practitioner of voodoo, though she was careful to maintain the facade of a simple herb seller to avoid unwanted attention from the authorities. The shop's interior was dimly lit by candles, and the air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, incense, and something else, something that spoke of power and ancient knowledge. Mama Brigitte emerged from the shadows, her weathered face creased with lines that spoke of decades of hardship and wisdom. "Child," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of her Haitian heritage, "I've been expecting you. The spirits, they whisper your name on the wind." Mary felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. "I need help, Mama Brigitte. I can't live like this anymore. Every day I watch them treat us like animals, and I feel something dark growing inside me." The old woman studied Mary's face in the candlelight, her eyes seeming to peer into her very soul. "Darkness, yes, but also power. You have the gift, child, the ability to make men see what you want them to see, to make them desire what will destroy them." From beneath the counter, Mama Brigitte produced a small cloth bag filled with herbs and what appeared to be bone fragments. "This gris-gris will enhance what already lies within you," But remember, child, power always comes with a price. Once you start down this path, there ain't no turning back. Mary took the bag, feeling its weight in her palm. It seemed heavier than it should, as if it contained more than just herbs and bones. What kind of price? The price of becoming something more than human, but also something less. You will have the power to destroy your enemies, but you will also lose pieces of yourself with each life you take. The question is, are you willing to pay it? As Mary walked back through the empty streets, the gris-gris bag clutched in her hand, she thought of Colonel Thibodeau's words about making examples of slaves who dared to look their masters in the eye. She thought of Dr. Rousseau's casual discussion of using fear as a tool of control. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake, listening to the sounds of other slave women being violated by their masters, powerless to help them or herself. By the time she reached the Beauregard mansion, her decision was made. The heat of the summer night seemed to pulse through her veins like liquid fire, and for the first time in her life, Mary Delacroix felt truly alive. The transformation had begun. 3 days after her visit to Mama Brigitte's shop, Mary found herself serving at another of Madame Beauregard's elaborate dinner parties. The gris-gris bag hung hidden beneath her dress, its presence a constant reminder of the power that now coursed through her veins. She had noticed changes, subtle at first, but growing stronger each day. Men's eyes lingered on her longer than before, their conversations faltered when she entered a room, and she could sense their desires like heat radiating from their bodies. Tonight's guest of honor was Monsieur Gaston Moreau, a wealthy sugar plantation owner known throughout New Orleans for his cruelty toward his slaves. Stories circulated of workers who had simply disappeared after displeasing him, and of young slave women who had been found floating in the bayou after catching his attention. As Mary served the soup course, she felt Moreau's eyes following her movements. He was a man in his 50s, with graying hair and soft hands that had never known honest labor. His wife had died the previous winter, leaving him free to indulge his darker appetites without even the pretense of propriety. "Beauregard," Moreau said, his voice thick with wine and desire. "That girl of yours, she's quite striking. Is she for sale?" Monsieur Beauregard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Mary, I'm afraid not, my friend. She's far too valuable in the kitchen. But perhaps we could arrange other accommodations." Mary's hands trembled slightly as she ladled soup into Moreau's bowl, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The opportunity to test the power that Mama Brigitte had awakened within her. As she leaned forward to serve him, Mary allowed her eyes to meet Moreau's directly. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. She felt something electric pass between them. His pupils dilated, and his breathing became shallow. She could sense his pulse quickening, his rational thoughts dissolving in a haze of sudden, overwhelming desire. "Perhaps," Mary whispered, her voice barely audible but somehow carrying clearly to his ears, "Monsieur would enjoy a walk in the garden after dinner. The night air might provide relief from this terrible heat." Moreau nodded mutely, his eyes never leaving her face. The other dinner guests continued their conversation, oblivious to the silent exchange that had just taken place. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of anticipation. Mary went about her duties mechanically, her mind focused on what was to come. She had spent the past 3 days studying Moreau's habits, learning his routines, and planning her approach. Tonight, she would discover if the power Mama Brigitte had promised was real. As the clock struck 11, the last of the guests departed, leaving only Moreau, who had lingered under the pretense of discussing business with Monsieur Beauregard. Mary watched from the shadows as her master retired to his study with a bottle of brandy, leaving Moreau alone in the parlor. She approached him slowly, her movements fluid and hypnotic. The gas lamps had been dimmed, casting the room in a golden glow that seemed to emanate from her very skin. Moreau rose from his chair as if drawn by invisible strings, his eyes glazed with an unnatural hunger. "The garden," she said simply, and he followed her like a man in a trance. The Beauregard garden was a maze of exotic plants and hidden alcoves designed for romantic encounters and secret meetings. Spanish moss hung from ancient oak trees like ghostly curtains, and the air was heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine. Mary led Moreau to a secluded corner where a marble bench sat beside a small fountain, the sound of trickling water masking their voices. "You're so beautiful," Moreau breathed, reaching out to touch her face. "I've never seen anything like you." Mary allowed him to caress her cheek, all the while studying his face in the moonlight. This man had caused so much suffering, had destroyed so many lives without a moment's remorse. Now he stood before her, vulnerable and completely under her spell. "Tell me about your plantation," she said softly, her voice like honey mixed with poison. "Tell me about the slaves who work your fields." As if compelled by forces beyond his control, Moreau began to speak. He told her of the punishments he inflicted for the smallest infractions, of the women he had taken by force, of the children he had sold away from their mothers. With each confession, Mary felt the darkness within her growing stronger, feeding on his guilt and her rage. "You enjoy causing pain," she observed, her hand trailing down his chest. "You find pleasure in the suffering of others." "Yes," he admitted, his voice thick with shame and arousal. "God help me, yes." Mary smiled, and in the moonlight her expression was both beautiful and terrible. "Then you'll understand what comes next." The blade appeared in her hand as if by magic, a thin, sharp knife that she had taken from the kitchen and blessed with oils from Mama Brigitte's shop. Moreau's eyes widened as he saw it, but he seemed unable to move, trapped by the power of her gaze. "Please," he whispered, but whether he was begging for mercy or for something else entirely, neither of them could say. Mary's hand moved with practiced precision, the blade sliding across his throat in one smooth motion. Blood flowed like a dark river in the moonlight, and Moreau's body crumpled to the ground beside the fountain. The sound of his death was lost beneath the gentle splash of water over stone. As she stood over his corpse, Mary felt a surge of power unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was intoxicating and terrifying, filling her with a sense of purpose and dread in equal measure. She had crossed a line from which there could be no return, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. She cleaned the blade carefully and tucked it back into the folds of her dress. Tomorrow, Moreau's body would be discovered, and the authorities would assume he had been killed by robbers, or perhaps by one of his own slaves seeking revenge. No one would suspect the quiet house slave who had served him soup just hours before. As Mary made her way back to the mansion, she could feel the spirits of the dead stirring around her, drawn by the scent of blood and vengeance. The summer heat seemed to pulse with new energy, and she knew that this was only the beginning. The legend of Mary of New Orleans had claimed its first victim. Word of Gaston Moreau's death spread through New Orleans like wildfire, carried on the humid summer breeze that seemed to whisper secrets to anyone willing to listen. The official story, as reported in the Daily Picayune, was that the plantation owner had been murdered by unknown assailants while walking alone in the French Quarter. His throat had been cut with surgical precision, and his body had been found at dawn by a street sweeper, drained of blood and bearing no signs of robbery. But in the slave quarters and the hidden corners where the city's oppressed gathered, a different story began to take shape. They spoke in hushed tones of justice finally being served, of a dark angel who had come to settle old debts. The name Mary was whispered with a mixture of fear and hope, though few knew if she was real or merely a legend born from desperate dreams of freedom. Mary herself continued her duties at the Beauregard mansion as if nothing had changed, but those with keen eyes might have noticed subtle differences. She moved with a new confidence, her posture straighter, her gaze more direct. The other slaves began to treat her with a deference that bordered on reverence, sensing something powerful and dangerous in her presence. Mama Brigitte watched these developments with knowing eyes. From her shop in the hidden alley, she could feel the ripples of power spreading through the city like cracks in a dam. The old woman had seen this before, in Haiti during the revolution, when ordinary people had been transformed into instruments of divine vengeance. But she also knew the price such power demanded, and she wondered if Mary truly understood what she had set in motion. 3 weeks after Moreau's death, Mary received an unexpected visitor. She was hanging laundry in the mansion's courtyard when a young slave boy approached her, his eyes wide with fear and excitement. "Miss Mary," he whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't being watched. "There's a man wants to see you. Says his name is Claude, and he's got a message from someone important." Mary's hand stilled on the wet sheet she was hanging. She had been expecting this. Word of her actions had spread too far to remain secret forever. "Where is he?" "Congo Square, by the old oak tree. He says to come after dark, when the drums start playing." Congo Square was the only place in New Orleans where slaves were allowed to gather freely, at least on Sundays. But during the week, it became a meeting place for those who moved in the shadows, escaped slaves, free people of color, and others who existed on the margins of society. The sound of drums that echoed from the square each evening served as both celebration and communication, carrying messages that only the initiated could understand. That night, Mary made her way through the darkened streets, her senses alert for any sign of danger. The city felt different after midnight, more alive somehow, as if the oppressive heat of the day had awakened something primal and ancient. Gas lamps flickered like dying stars, and shadows seemed to move with purpose through the narrow alleys. She found Claude waiting beneath the massive oak tree that dominated Congo Square, its gnarled branches reaching toward the star-filled sky like the arms of some primordial god. He was a tall, lean man, with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much. Scars crisscrossed his forearms, marks of a life spent in bondage. But he carried himself with the dignity of a free man. "Mary Delacroix," he said, his voice carrying the musical accent of the Caribbean islands. "I bring greetings from those who fight in the shadows." "And who might that be?" Mary asked, though she suspected she already knew. "The Underground Railroad has many branches, some that run north to freedom, others that run deeper into the darkness. We've heard of your talents. There are those who believe you could be valuable to our cause." Mary studied his face in the moonlight, searching for signs of deception or trap. "What cause would that be?" Claude smiled, and she could see that several of his teeth were missing, likely knocked out by an overseer's fist. "The cause of justice, sister. The cause of making our oppressors pay for their crimes in blood." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch, similar to the gris-gris bag that Mama Brigitte had given her, but somehow different, older, more powerful. "This comes from the mountains of Haiti, blessed by the spirits of those who died fighting for freedom. It will enhance your abilities, make you even more irresistible to those who would harm our people." Mary took the pouch, feeling its weight in her palm. The leather was warm to the touch, as if it contained living fire. "What do you want in return?" "There's a man named Captain Dubois who runs a slave ship called the Serpent's Kiss. He's been bringing fresh captives from Africa, selling them at the market on Chartres Street. But he's also been taking liberties with the women during the voyage, using them, breaking them, sometimes killing them for sport." Mary's jaw tightened. She had heard rumors of such men, sea captains who treated their human cargo as playthings rather than property. "Where can I find him?" "He frequents the Café du Monde after his ships come in, usually around midnight. He likes to drink and boast about his conquests to anyone who will listen. A man like that, he would be susceptible to your particular gifts." Claude stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. But be careful, sister. Dubois is not like the plantation owners you've dealt with before. He's killed men with his bare hands, and he's suspicious by nature. If you're going to take him, you'll need to be smarter than you've ever been before. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of drums began to echo across the square, a complex rhythm that spoke of ancient gods and older hungers. Mary felt the new gris-gris bag pulse in response, its power calling to something deep within her soul. There's something else, Claude continued. Word of your actions has reached certain influential people. There are those in the city who profit from the slave trade, who see you as a threat to their livelihood. They're starting to ask questions, to look for patterns. You'll need to be more careful than ever. Mary nodded, understanding the warning. She had known that her actions would eventually draw attention from those in power, but she had hoped to claim more victims before being forced to change her methods. How many others are there? She asked. Others like me, I mean. Claude's smile was enigmatic. More than you might think, fewer than we need. The spirits choose their instruments carefully, sister. Not everyone has the strength to walk the path you've chosen. As the drums grew louder, other figures began to emerge from the shadows. Men and women of various ages and backgrounds, all united by their shared oppression and their hunger for justice. They formed a loose circle around the oak tree, their movements synchronized with the ancient rhythm that seemed to pulse from the very earth itself. Mary found herself drawn into the circle, her body moving to the beat without conscious thought. The new gris-gris bag grew warm against her skin, and she could feel power flowing through her like electricity through copper wire. Around her, the other dancers began to chant in languages she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Words of power, of vengeance, of transformation. As the ritual reached its climax, Mary felt something fundamental shift within her. The last vestiges of the frightened slave girl she had once been burned away like morning mist, leaving behind something harder, more focused, more dangerous. She was no longer just Mary Delacroix. She was becoming something else entirely, something that would haunt the nightmares of those who profited from human suffering. When the drums finally fell silent and the circle dispersed, Claude approached her one final time. Remember, sister, Captain Dubois will be at the Café du Monde tomorrow night, but after him, you'll need to disappear for a while. Let the heat die down before you strike again. Mary nodded, her mind already working on the details of her next hunt. As she made her way back through the empty streets, she could feel the eyes of the city watching her. Some with hope, others with fear, all with the recognition that something had changed in the balance of power. The legend of Mary of New Orleans was growing, and with it, the promise of a reckoning that would shake the very foundations of the society that had created her. The Café du Monde sat like a beacon of civilization at the edge of the French Quarter, its gas lamps casting warm pools of light onto the cobblestone streets that led down to the Mississippi River. Even at midnight, the establishment buzzed with activity. Merchants closing deals over coffee and beignets, sailors spending their wages on whiskey and women, and the occasional gentleman seeking adventure in the city's more dangerous quarters. Mary positioned herself across the street, hidden in the shadows of a wrought-iron balcony, watching the cafe's entrance with the patience of a predator. She had spent the day gathering information about Captain Dubois, learning his habits and preferences from the dock workers and tavern girls who knew him best. The picture that emerged was of a man consumed by his own appetites, cruel, arrogant, and utterly convinced of his own invincibility. The new gris-gris bag that Claude had given her pulsed against her chest like a second heartbeat, its power flowing through her veins and sharpening her senses to an almost supernatural degree. She could smell the fear and desperation that clung to the slave ships moored at the docks, could hear the whispered prayers of those still trapped in their holds, could feel the weight of their suffering pressing down on her like a physical force. At midnight, Captain Dubois finally appeared. He was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick-necked, with the weathered skin of someone who had spent decades at sea. His clothes were expensive but poorly maintained, stained with wine and salt spray, and he moved with the rolling gait of a sailor even on dry land. A cutlass hung at his side, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who viewed other human beings as nothing more than cargo. Mary watched as he entered the cafe and took his usual table near the window, ordering a bottle of rum and settling in for what appeared to be a long night of drinking. She had learned that this was his pattern. After each voyage, he would spend several days at the cafe, regaling anyone who would listen with tales of his adventures and the profits he had made from his human cargo. She waited another hour, allowing him to consume enough alcohol to dull his reflexes, but not enough to render him unconscious. Then, with movements as fluid as water, she crossed the street and entered the cafe. The interior was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of strong coffee, the air heavy with the conversations of men who conducted their business in the shadows. Mary made her way to the bar, ordering a glass of wine and positioning herself where Dubois could see her clearly. She had chosen her outfit carefully, a dress that was elegant enough to suggest she was a free woman of color, but revealing enough to catch the attention of a man like the captain. It didn't take long. Within minutes, she felt his eyes upon her, studying her with the same calculating gaze he might use to evaluate a piece of valuable merchandise. She turned slightly, allowing their eyes to meet across the smoky room, and smiled, an expression that was both innocent and knowing, promising pleasures that existed only in a man's darkest fantasies. Dubois rose from his table with the deliberate movements of a man trying to hide his intoxication, making his way across the cafe with what he probably thought was casual confidence. Mary could smell the rum on his breath before he even spoke, could sense the violence that lurked just beneath his civilized veneer. "Good evening, mademoiselle," he said, his voice carrying the rough accent of the docks. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure of your acquaintance." "Perhaps not," Mary replied, her voice soft and musical. "But I've heard many stories about the famous Captain Dubois. They say you're a man who has seen the world and lived to tell the tale." His chest swelled with pride, just as she had known it would. Men like Dubois were predictable in their vanity, always eager to impress a beautiful woman with tales of their exploits. "Indeed I have, my dear. I've sailed from here to the Gold Coast and back, bringing civilization to the dark corners of the world." Mary's smile never wavered, even as rage burned in her chest at his casual description of the slave trade as bringing civilization. She gestured to an empty table in a darker corner of the cafe, away from the other patrons. "Perhaps you would honor me with some of those stories. I find tales of adventure so stimulating." They moved to the secluded table, and Mary listened with apparent fascination as Dubois regaled her with accounts of his voyages. He spoke of storms weathered and pirates defeated, of exotic ports and profitable cargoes, but always his stories returned to the human beings he transported in chains. He described them as if they were animals, noting their physical attributes and market value with the detached professionalism of a livestock dealer. "The women are always the most trouble," he said, his eyes growing dark with memory. "They fight, they weep, they try to throw themselves overboard. Sometimes you have to discipline them, to remind them of their place." Mary's hand tightened around her wine glass, but her expression remained one of rapt attention. "That must be very difficult for you, having to maintain order among so many unruly passengers." "It is indeed," Dubois agreed, mistaking her comment for sympathy. "But I've developed certain methods over the years. The key is to break their spirit early, to show them that resistance is futile. Once you've made an example of one or two, the others usually fall in line." As he spoke, Mary could see the ghosts of his victims gathering in the shadows around their table, young women torn from their families, Children who had died in the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold. Men who had been beaten to death for daring to maintain their dignity. Their silent accusations filled the air like smoke, and she felt the power of the gris-gris bag responding to their call for justice. "You must be very strong," she said, leaning closer to him across the small table. "To maintain control over so many people, to make such difficult decisions, it takes a special kind of man." Dubois preened under her praise, his hand reaching across the table to cover hers. His touch was rough and possessive, the hand of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted without asking permission. "You understand me, my dear. So few people do. They see only the profits, not the burden of command." Mary allowed him to hold her hand, even as her skin crawled at the contact. She could feel the blood of innocence on his fingers, could sense the darkness that had consumed his soul completely. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more. In private, the night is still young, and I find myself eager to hear more of your adventures." The suggestion hit its mark perfectly. Dubois' eyes lit up with anticipation, and he signaled for the waiter to bring their bill. "I have rooms at the Hotel St. Louis," he said, his voice thick with desire and alcohol. "We could be more comfortable there." "Actually," Mary said, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to bypass his conscious mind and speak directly to his desires, "I know a place that's much more intimate. A garden where we can be completely alone, where no one will disturb us." She could see his pupils dilate as the power of the gris-gris bag washed over him, clouding his judgment and amplifying his lust. Like Moreau before him, Dubois found himself nodding agreement to a suggestion that his sober mind might have questioned. They left the cafe together, Mary's arm linked through his, as they walked through the empty streets toward the old Ursuline convent. The building had been abandoned for several years, its gardens overgrown and wild, providing the perfect setting for what was to come. Spanish moss hung from the ancient trees like funeral shrouds, and the air was thick with the scent of night-blooming flowers and decay. Mary led him to a secluded corner of the garden where a crumbling stone bench sat beside a dry fountain, its basin filled with dead leaves and the bones of small animals. Moonlight filtered through the canopy above, casting everything in silver and shadow. "This is perfect," Dubois said, his hands already reaching for her. "So quiet, so private. No one to hear us, no matter how enthusiastic we become." Mary turned to face him, and in the moonlight her beauty was both ethereal and terrible. "Tell me, Captain," she said, her voice carrying an otherworldly quality that made the very air around them seem to vibrate. "Do you ever dream of them, the people you've destroyed?" For a moment confusion flickered across his features. "Dream of who, my dear? The women you've violated, the children you've sold, the men you've murdered. Do their faces visit you in the night?" Dubois' expression hardened, and his hand moved instinctively toward the cutlass at his side. But he found himself unable to draw the weapon, his muscles refusing to obey his commands. The power that surrounded Mary was like a physical force, holding him in place as surely as iron chains. "What are you?" he whispered, fear finally penetrating the fog of alcohol and lust. Mary smiled, and her teeth gleamed like pearls in the moonlight. "I am justice, Captain. I am the voice of every soul you've silenced, the vengeance of every life you've destroyed. I am what you made me." The blade appeared in her hand, not the simple kitchen knife she had used on Moreau, but something older and more terrible. It was a ceremonial dagger that Claude had given her, along with the gris-gris bag, its obsidian blade carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and dance in the moonlight. "Please," Dubois begged, his voice breaking like a child's. "I have money, influence. I can give you anything you want." "You have nothing I want," Mary replied, her voice as cold as the grave. "But you have everything I need to take." The dagger moved with supernatural speed, opening his throat in a single precise cut. But this time, Mary didn't simply watch him die. As his blood flowed onto the ancient stones, she began to chant in a language that predated civilization, calling upon powers that had slumbered since the world was young. Dubois' eyes widened in terror as he felt his life force being drawn from his body, not just his blood, but his very essence being consumed by the darkness that surrounded Mary. He tried to scream, but no sound emerged from his severed throat. He could only watch in horror as his memories, his experiences, his very soul was devoured by the creature he had mistaken for a vulnerable woman. When it was over, Mary stood over his desiccated corpse, feeling more powerful than ever before. She could sense his knowledge flowing through her, the locations of his hidden treasures, the names of his associates, the routes of his slave ships. All of it would be useful in the war she was waging against those who profited from human suffering. As she cleaned the ceremonial dagger and tucked it back into the folds of her dress, Mary heard the sound of footsteps approaching through the garden. She turned to see Claude emerging from the shadows, his face grave with concern. "It is done?" he asked, though the answer was obvious from the scene before him. "It is done," Mary confirmed. "But this was different from before. I could feel his memories, his knowledge. I know things now that I didn't know before." Claude nodded, unsurprised. "The power grows stronger with each life you take, but so does the danger. Dubois was well connected. His disappearance will not go unnoticed. You'll need to be even more careful now." Mary looked down at the captain's remains, feeling no remorse for what she had done. Let them notice. Let them fear. The more they understand that their crimes have consequences, the better. "Perhaps," Claude said, "but remember, you are not invincible. There are those in this city who have power of their own, who will not hesitate to use it against you if they feel threatened. The real test is yet to come." And as they left the garden together, Mary could feel the truth of his words settling over her like a shroud. She had claimed 2 victims now, but each kill had made her more visible to those who might seek to stop her. The game was becoming more dangerous, but she found that the prospect of greater challenges only made her hunger for justice burn brighter. The legend of Mary of New Orleans was spreading through the city like a fever, and soon, very soon, her enemies would be forced to confront the monster they had created. The discovery of Captain Dubois' body sent shockwaves through New Orleans' elite society. Unlike Moreau's death, which could be dismissed as a random act of violence, the captain's murder bore all the hallmarks of something far more sinister. The ritualistic nature of the killing, the complete draining of blood, and the strange symbols carved into the nearby trees spoke of dark forces at work in the heart of the city. Detective Inspector Henri Laveau, no relation to the famous voodoo priestess Marie Laveau, though he often found himself explaining the coincidence, stood in the abandoned convent garden, studying the crime scene with the methodical attention of a man who had seen too much death in his 30 years of service. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the stone bench where Dubois's desiccated corpse had been found, and the detective could feel an unnatural chill in the air despite the oppressive summer heat. 2 prominent men dead in less than a month, said his assistant, Sergeant Boudreau, a nervous young man who kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the overgrown vegetation. Both with their throats cut, both found in secluded locations. "This isn't coincidence, Inspector." Laveau nodded grimly, his weathered face creased with concern. He had been investigating crimes in New Orleans for 3 decades, had seen everything from simple murders to elaborate conspiracies. But this case felt different. There was something almost supernatural about the precision of the killings, the complete absence of witnesses, and the strange atmosphere that seemed to cling to each crime scene. "Have you spoken to the slaves at the Beauregard mansion?" Laveau asked, though he already suspected what the answer would be. "Yes, sir. They all claim to know nothing about Moreau's death. The girl who served at the dinner party, Mary something, she seemed particularly nervous, but that's not unusual. Most slaves get frightened when questioned by the authorities. Laveau made a mental note to interview this Mary personally. In his experience, nervous witnesses often knew more than they initially revealed, and something about this case suggested that the answers lay within the slave community rather than among the white elite. Meanwhile, across the city in the Beauregard mansion, Mary was going about her morning duties with apparent calm, but her mind was racing with calculations and contingencies. She had known that Dubois' death would attract more attention than Moreau's, had prepared for the possibility of increased scrutiny, but the reality of being hunted was more unsettling than she had anticipated. The other slaves in the household had begun to treat her with a mixture of awe and fear. Word of her nocturnal activities had spread through the underground network of the oppressed, and she had become a figure of legend among those who dreamed of freedom. But with fame came danger, and Mary knew that it was only a matter of time before someone connected her to the murders. That afternoon, as she was preparing vegetables in the kitchen, Madame Beauregard entered with a stern expression, and a man Mary didn't recognize, a tall, thin individual with pale skin and calculating eyes that seemed to see too much. "Mary," Madame Beauregard said, her voice sharp with authority, "this is Detective Inspector Laveau. He has some questions for you about the recent unpleasantness in the city." Mary kept her eyes downcast in the manner expected of a slave, but she could feel the detective's gaze studying her with uncomfortable intensity. There was something about him that set her nerves on edge, an intelligence and perception that made her feel exposed despite her careful preparations. "Mary," Laveau said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I understand you served at a dinner party here recently where Monsieur Moreau was a guest. Can you tell me about that evening?" "Yes, sir," Mary replied, keeping her voice steady and subservient. "I served the soup course and helped clear the table. Monsieur Moreau seemed to enjoy the meal." "Did you notice anything unusual about his behavior? Did he seem nervous or frightened?" Mary shook her head. "No, sir. He appeared to be in good spirits, laughing and talking with the other gentlemen." Laveau studied her face carefully, looking for any sign of deception. "And after the dinner party, did you see Monsieur Moreau again that evening?" "No, sir. I retired to my quarters after finishing my duties in the kitchen." The detective nodded, but Mary could sense that he wasn't entirely satisfied with her answers. There was something in his eyes, a suspicion that went beyond mere professional thoroughness. "Tell me, Mary," he continued, "have you heard any talk among the other slaves about these murders? Any rumors or speculation about who might be responsible?" This was dangerous territory. Mary knew that many of the slaves viewed her as a hero, that some had even begun to whisper prayers to her as if she were a saint or spirit of vengeance. But she also knew that revealing any knowledge of such talk would only increase suspicion. "People are frightened, sir," she said carefully. "There's talk of evil spirits and curses, but I don't put much stock in such superstitions." Laveau's eyes narrowed slightly. "Superstitions? You don't believe in voodoo, then?" Mary felt a chill run down her spine. The detective was more perceptive than she had given him credit for, and his questions were leading toward dangerous ground. "I'm a Christian, sir. I attend services at the cathedral when my duties permit." "Of course," Laveau said, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, if you remember anything else about that evening, or if you hear any information that might be helpful, please don't hesitate to contact me." After the detective left, Mary found herself shaking with a combination of fear and rage. She had managed to deflect his questions for now, but she knew he would be back. Men like Laveau didn't give up easily, and his suspicions would only grow stronger with time. That evening she made her way to Mama Brigitte's shop, moving through the shadows with even more caution than usual. The old woman was waiting for her, as if she had sensed Mary's approach through some supernatural means. "Child," Mama Brigitte said, her voice heavy with concern, "the spirits are restless tonight. They whisper of danger approaching, of hunters who seek to trap the huntress." "The police are asking questions," Mary said, settling into a chair across from the elderly voodoo practitioner. A detective named Laveau. He suspects something. Mama Brigitte's eyes widened at the name. Henri Laveau? That man is more dangerous than you know, child. His grandmother was a powerful mambo, a priestess of the old ways. He may not practice the religion himself, but he carries the blood of those who could see beyond the veil. Mary felt her heart sink. She had hoped that her supernatural abilities would be enough to protect her from mundane threats, but if the detective had inherited even a fraction of his grandmother's gifts, he might prove to be a formidable opponent. What should I do? She asked. Mama Brigitte reached beneath her counter and withdrew a small mirror framed in black wood and carved with protective symbols. This will show you when enemies approach, will warn you of danger before it strikes. But more importantly, you must change your methods. The pattern you've established, targeting prominent men, using seduction as your weapon, it's too predictable. Your enemies are learning to anticipate your moves. Mary took the mirror, feeling its weight in her hands. The surface was dark and reflective, but she could sense something moving within its depths, shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. There's something else, Mama Brigitte continued. Word has reached certain influential people about your activities. There are those in this city who profit greatly from the slave trade, who see you as a threat to their livelihood. They're organizing, pooling their resources to hunt you down. Let them come, Mary said, her voice hard with determination. I'm not afraid of a few frightened plantation owners. You should be, the old woman replied sharply. These are not ordinary men, child. Some of them have their own connections to the dark arts, their own sources of power, and they have resources you can't imagine. Money, influence, private armies of men who kill for sport. As if summoned by their conversation, the mirror in Mary's hands began to glow with an eerie light. Images flickered across its surface, men in expensive suits gathering in a smoke-filled room, their faces twisted with hatred and fear. She could see Detective Laveau among them, along with several other figures she recognized as prominent members of New Orleans society. They're meeting tonight, she whispered, watching the scene unfold in the mirror's depths, planning something. Mama Brigitte leaned forward to look at the images. The Trem plantation, just outside the city. That's where they're gathering. But child, you must not... Mary was already standing, her mind racing with possibilities. This could be my chance to end it all at once. If I can eliminate the leaders of this conspiracy, you'll be walking into a trap, Mama Brigitte said urgently. They know you're coming, child. They're counting on your pride, your anger to make you reckless. But Mary was no longer listening. The mirror showed her a dozen of her enemies gathered in one place, vulnerable and unsuspecting. It was an opportunity too good to pass up, regardless of the risks involved. Give me whatever protections you can, she said, her voice filled with deadly resolve. Tonight, the legend of Mary of New Orleans either ends in glory or dies in flames. Mama Brigitte sighed, recognizing the futility of trying to dissuade her. Then may the spirits protect you, child. You'll need all the help you can get. As Mary prepared for what might be her final hunt, she could feel the weight of destiny settling around her like a shroud. The game had changed, the stakes had been raised, and tonight would determine whether she was truly the instrument of divine justice she believed herself to be, or simply another victim of the system she sought to destroy. The summer heat pressed down on New Orleans like a suffocating blanket, and in the distance, thunder rumbled across the darkening sky. A storm was coming, and it would wash the city clean with blood and rain. The Trem plantation sat like a monument to human cruelty on the outskirts of New Orleans, its grand mansion rising from manicured grounds that had been watered with the blood and sweat of countless enslaved souls. Tonight, the estate's windows glowed with warm light, and the sound of conversation and laughter drifted across the humid air, the voices of men who had gathered to discuss the elimination of a threat to their way of life. Mary crouched in the Spanish moss that draped from an ancient oak tree, studying the mansion through the protective mirror that Mama Brigitte had given her. The surface showed her not just the physical layout of the building, but the spiritual energies that surrounded it. Dark auras that spoke of violence and corruption, protective wards that had been placed by practitioners of the darker arts, and something else that made her blood run cold. They were expecting her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a meeting of frightened plantation owners. It was an elaborate trap designed to lure her into a confrontation she couldn't win. But even as fear crept into her heart, Mary felt her resolve hardening. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to turn back now. Inside the mansion, Detective Inspector Laveau stood before a gathering of New Orleans' most powerful men, his weathered face grim with determination. The parlor was thick with cigar smoke and the tension of men who were accustomed to controlling their world, but now found themselves threatened by forces they didn't understand. "Gentlemen," Laveau said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades bringing order to chaos, "we all know why we're here. This creature that calls herself Mary has murdered 2 prominent citizens and shows no signs of stopping. If we don't act tonight, none of us will be safe." Colonel Thibodeau, his face flushed with wine and indignation, slammed his fist on the mahogany table. "It's an outrage. A slave, a piece of property, daring to raise her hand against her betters. In my day, we would have burned down every slave quarter in the city until someone gave her up." "Your day is ending, Colonel," said a new voice from the shadows. The speaker stepped into the lamplight, revealing himself to be a tall, gaunt man with pale skin and eyes the color of winter ice. Dr. Matthias Blackwood was known throughout the city as a physician and scholar, but those with knowledge of the darker arts whispered that his true expertise lay in realms that decent people preferred not to contemplate. "Dr. Blackwood," Laveau said, his voice carefully neutral, "I wasn't certain you would come." "How could I resist?" Blackwood replied, his thin lips curving into what might have been a smile. "It's not often one encounters a practitioner of such raw talent. This Mary has managed to channel forces that most people can't even perceive, much less control. She's quite fascinating, really." "Fascinating or not," interrupted Judge Beaumont, a corpulent man whose judicial robes had been purchased with bribes and blood money. "She needs to be stopped. The very foundation of our society is at stake." Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. Which is why I've taken the liberty of preparing certain countermeasures. The wards I've placed around this estate will prevent her from using her supernatural abilities to escape once she's inside, and I've brought along some associates who specialize in dealing with practitioners of the darker arts." As if summoned by his words, 3 figures emerged from the shadows at the edge of the room. They were dressed in dark robes that seemed to absorb the lamplight, and their faces were hidden behind masks carved from human bone. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as they took their positions around the parlor. "Witch hunters," Laveau said, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "I thought they were just legends." "Oh, they're quite real," Blackwood assured him. "The church has been training them for centuries to deal with threats like our dear Mary. They have methods that are most effective." Outside, Mary felt the change in the spiritual atmosphere around the mansion like a physical blow. The protective wards that Blackwood had erected were powerful, designed not just to contain her, but to weaken her connection to the spirits that gave her strength. She could sense the presence of the witch hunters as well, cold, empty voids in the fabric of reality that spoke of souls that had been deliberately hollowed out to make room for divine purpose. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Mary remembered the faces of all those who had suffered under the system these men represented. She thought of the women who had been violated by Captain Dubois, of the families torn apart by the slave trade, of the children who had died in the fields under the merciless sun. Their voices called to her across the veil between life and death, demanding justice, demanding vengeance. She reached into her dress and withdrew the ceremonial dagger that Claude had given her, its obsidian blade seeming to drink in the moonlight. The gris-gris bags that hung around her neck pulsed with power, and she could feel the spirits of her ancestors gathering around her like an invisible army. "If this is to be my last night," she whispered to the darkness, "then let it be a night that they remember for generations to come." Mary began to move through the shadows toward the mansion, her form seeming to blend with the darkness itself. The protective wards that Blackwood had erected were powerful, but they had been designed to contain a single practitioner. They hadn't accounted for the possibility that Mary might not be acting alone. As she approached the mansion's walls, other figures began to emerge from the surrounding darkness. Claude appeared first, his scarred face set with grim determination, followed by a dozen other slaves who had escaped their bonds and joined the growing resistance. They moved with the silent coordination of people who had learned to survive in a world that wanted them dead, and each carried weapons that had been blessed by Mama Brigitte herself. "Sister," Claude whispered as he reached Mary's side, "you don't have to do this alone." "This is my fight," Mary replied, but her voice carried gratitude for his presence. "No," said another voice, and Mary turned to see Mama Brigitte herself emerging from the shadows, her elderly frame somehow radiating power that made the very air around her shimmer. "This is our fight. It always has been." The old woman raised her hands, and Mary could feel the protective wards around the mansion beginning to weaken as Mama Brigitte's power clashed with Blackwood's defenses. Sparks of supernatural energy crackled through the air, and the Spanish moss hanging from the trees began to writhe as if alive. Inside the mansion, Blackwood suddenly stiffened, his pale face growing even whiter as he felt his carefully constructed defenses being systematically dismantled. "She's not alone," he said, his voice tight with alarm. "There are others with her, powerful others." The witch hunters moved with inhuman speed, their bone masks gleaming in the lamplight as they took defensive positions around the room. But even as they prepared for battle, Mary and her allies were already inside the mansion, having entered through passages that existed in the spaces between reality and dream. The first sign of their presence was the temperature dropping so suddenly that the men's breath became visible in the air. Then the lamps began to flicker and dim, as if some invisible force was draining the light from the room. Finally, Mary herself materialized in the center of the parlor, her form seeming to coalesce from shadow and moonlight. She was no longer the frightened slave girl who had served soup at dinner parties. The woman who stood before them was something else entirely, a figure of terrible beauty and implacable purpose, her eyes burning with the fire of righteous vengeance. The ceremonial dagger in her hand seemed to pulse with its own dark light, and the air around her shimmered with barely contained power. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the physical, "I believe you wanted to see me." The confrontation that followed would be remembered in whispers for generations to come. A battle between the old order and the forces of change, between those who profited from human suffering and those who had suffered under their rule. It was por favor, continue girando a sua resposta. Expert Logo T01. A night when the very foundations of New Orleans society would be shaken to their core, and when the legend of Mary would either reach its climax or meet its end. The first witch hunter moved with inhuman speed, his bone mask gleaming as he lunged toward Mary with a blade that seemed to absorb light itself. But Mary was no longer bound by the limitations of mortal flesh. She flowed like water around his attack, her own dagger finding the gap between his ribs with surgical precision. The hunter's scream was cut short as his life force was drained away. But even as he fell, his two companions were already moving. They chanted in a language that predated Christianity, their voices weaving a web of binding spells designed to trap Mary's spirit within her physical form. But they hadn't counted on Mama Brigitte. The old woman stepped through the mansion's wall as if it were made of mist, her form radiating power that made the very foundations of the building tremble. She spoke a single word in the ancient tongue of her ancestors, and the witch hunter's binding spells shattered like glass, their fragments cutting through the air with deadly force. "You dare bring your pale magic into my city," Mama Brigitte said, her voice carrying the authority of centuries. "You dare threaten my children with your hollow righteousness, Doctor." Blackwood raised his hands, dark energy crackling between his fingers as he prepared to unleash forces that would have reduced a normal person to ash. But before he could complete his incantation, Claude appeared behind him, a blessed blade sliding between his shoulder blades with the precision of a man who had learned anatomy through necessity. The doctor's scream echoed through the mansion as his own dark power turned against him, consuming him from within. His carefully maintained facade of civilization cracked and fell away, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath. Meanwhile, the remaining plantation owners and officials scrambled for weapons or tried to flee, but they found the mansion's exit sealed by forces beyond their comprehension. They were trapped with the very evil they had sought to destroy, and now that evil was exacting its price. Mary moved through them like death incarnate, her blade finding its mark with each strike. But she didn't simply kill, she judged. Each man faced a reckoning for his crimes, forced to confront the suffering he had caused before his life was forfeit. Colonel Thibodeau found himself reliving every moment of cruelty he had inflicted on his slaves, feeling their pain as if it were his own. Judge Beaumont experienced the despair of every innocent person he had condemned to preserve his own wealth and status. One by one they fell, their blood watering the floor of the mansion that had been built on the foundation of human misery. Detective Inspector Laveau was the last to face Mary's judgment. Unlike the others, he showed no fear as she approached, his weathered face set with the resignation of a man who had always known this moment would come. "You're not just a killer," he said, his voice steady despite the carnage around him. "You're something else, entirely. Something that was created by the very system you're destroying." Mary paused, her blade hovering inches from his throat. "And what am I, detective?" "You're the reckoning," he replied. "The price that was always going to be paid for the sins of this city. My grandmother saw it in her visions, a dark angel who would rise from the ashes of oppression to burn away the corruption." "Then you know why I can't let you live." Laveau nodded slowly. "I know. But before you take my life, let me tell you something. This won't end with my death, or even with the death of everyone in this room. The system is bigger than any of us, deeper than you can imagine. You've won a battle tonight, but the war will continue long after you're gone." Mary's blade found its mark, but Laveau's words echoed in her mind as his life ebbed away. She had eliminated her immediate enemies, had struck a blow against those who profited from human suffering, but she knew he was right. The system that had created her would endure, would adapt, would find new ways to perpetuate itself. As the last of her enemies fell, Mary stood in the center of the blood-soaked parlor, feeling the weight of what she had accomplished and what still lay ahead. The mansion around her began to burn, whether from supernatural fire or the more mundane flames that Claude and the others had set. She couldn't say. But as the building was consumed, she felt a sense of completion, of a chapter ending and a new one beginning. Mama Brigitte approached her through the smoke and flames, her ancient face creased with something that might have been pride or sorrow. "It is done, child. Your enemies are dead. Your people are free to fight another day." "But the price..." Mary looked down at her hands, seeing not just the blood of her enemies, but something else. A darkness that had taken root in her soul, feeding on violence and growing stronger with each life she claimed. She had become exactly what her enemies had accused her of being, a monster, but she had also become something more, a symbol, a legend, a promise that oppression would not go unanswered forever. The price was always going to be paid, she said, echoing Laveau's words. The only question was, who would pay it? As they emerged from the burning mansion into the humid New Orleans night, Mary could feel the spirits of the dead following in her wake. Not just her victims, but all those who had suffered under the system she had challenged. They whispered her name like a prayer, like a curse, like a promise of things to come. The legend of Mary of New Orleans had reached its climax, but the story was far from over. In the days and weeks to come, word of what had happened at the Trem plantation would spread throughout the South, carried by escaped slaves and sympathetic abolitionists. Some would call her a hero, others a demon, but all would remember her name. And in the shadows of other cities, other oppressed souls would hear her story and feel something stirring in their hearts, a hunger for justice, a thirst for vengeance, a willingness to pay any price for freedom. The fire that Mary had lit in New Orleans would spread, carried by those who understood that sometimes the only way to destroy a system built on violence was to meet it with violence of their own. The summer of 1839 was ending, but the heat of revolution was just beginning to burn. 3 months had passed since the fire at the Trem plantation, and New Orleans had settled into an uneasy peace. The official story, as reported in the newspapers, was that a gas lamp had exploded during a private gathering, killing several prominent citizens in the resulting blaze. The authorities spoke of a tragic accident, but in the slave quarters and the hidden corners of the city, people whispered of darker truths. Mary Delacroix had vanished the night of the fire, disappearing into the bayous and swamplands that surrounded the city like a protective embrace. Some said she had died in the flames along with her enemies. Others claimed she had transformed into something beyond human understanding, becoming a spirit of vengeance that would return whenever injustice grew too great to bear. But those who knew the truth understood that she had simply moved on, carrying her mission to other cities, other plantations, other places where the innocent suffered under the weight of oppression. The impact of her actions rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. The slave trade in New Orleans had been disrupted, not destroyed, but significantly weakened by the elimination of key figures in its operation. Several plantations had been abandoned as their owners fled north, fearing that they might be next on Mary's list. The Underground Railroad had gained new routes and new supporters, emboldened by the knowledge that resistance was possible. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Mary of New Orleans had become something larger than the woman herself. In slave cabins from Virginia to Texas, mothers told their children tales of the beautiful woman who had turned the master's own weapons against them. In the hidden churches where enslaved people gathered to worship in secret, preachers spoke of divine justice taking human form. In the meeting places of abolitionists, both black and white, Mary's name was invoked as proof that the system of slavery contained the seeds of its own destruction. Detective Inspector Henri Laveau's replacement, a younger man named Captain Morrison, who had been brought in from Boston, found himself investigating a series of mysterious deaths that bore striking similarities to the New Orleans murders. A plantation owner in Mississippi had been found with his throat cut in his own garden. A slave trader in Mobile had disappeared from a tavern, leaving only bloodstains and whispered rumors of a beautiful woman who had been seen talking to him earlier that evening. A judge in Charleston who had made his fortune returning escaped slaves to their masters had been discovered dead in his chambers, his body drained of blood and his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Morrison had studied the reports from New Orleans, had interviewed the few survivors of the Trem plantation fire, and had come to a conclusion that he dared not put in his official reports. They were dealing with something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of law enforcement. Whether Mary was a single individual with supernatural abilities or a symbol that had inspired a network of imitators, the result was the same. The comfortable certainty of the old order was crumbling. In the bayous outside New Orleans, in a cabin hidden among the cypress trees and Spanish moss, Mary sat before a small altar adorned with candles, bones, and offerings to the spirits of her ancestors. The months since the plantation fire had changed her in ways both subtle and profound. The darkness that had taken root in her soul had grown stronger, but so had her understanding of the forces she commanded. She was no longer the frightened slave girl who had sought help from Mama Brigitte. She'd become something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between human and spirit, between justice and vengeance. Claude sat across from her, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. He had become her lieutenant, her connection to the network of escaped slaves and sympathizers who carried out her will across the South. Tonight, he brought news from their agents in other cities, reports of successful operations and new targets identified. The plantation owner in Georgia, Whitmore, he's been eliminated, Claude reported, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who had seen justice served. Our people made it look like an accident, a fall from his horse during a hunting expedition, but the slaves on his plantation know the truth. Mary nodded, feeling a familiar surge of dark satisfaction. Whitmore had been particularly cruel, known for his practice of separating slave families as punishment for minor infractions. His death would send a message to others like him, while also providing practical benefits. His plantation would likely be sold, and the new owner might prove more amenable to treating his human property with basic decency. What of the judge in Savannah, she asked, still alive, but frightened. He's hired bodyguards, rarely leaves his house, and has started freeing some of his slaves, apparently hoping to buy protection through good deeds. Claude's smile was grim. Fear can be as effective as death, sometimes more so. Mary stood and walked to the cabin's single window, looking out at the dark waters of the bayou. Somewhere in the distance, an alligator bellowed, and nightbirds called to each other through the humid air. This was her domain now, this liminal space between civilization and wilderness, between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. There's something else, Claude continued, his voice growing more serious. Mama Brigitte wants to see you. She says the spirits have been restless, that they're trying to warn her about something. Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Mama Brigitte's warnings had always proven accurate, and if the old woman was concerned, there was good reason to be afraid. The next evening, Mary made her way through the familiar streets of New Orleans, moving like a shadow through the French Quarter toward Mama Brigitte's shop. The city felt different now, more watchful, more aware of the forces that moved beneath its civilized surface. She could sense the fear that lingered in the minds of those who profited from human suffering, could feel their paranoia like a tangible presence in the humid air. Mama Brigitte was waiting for her, as always, but the old woman's face was creased with worry lines that hadn't been there before. The shop felt different too. The protective wards were stronger, and there was an urgency in the air that spoke of approaching danger. "Child," Mama Brigitte said without preamble, "you need to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you. The spirits have shown me visions, dark ones. There are forces gathering against you, powers that make Dr. Blackwood look like a child playing with toys." Mary settled into her usual chair, but she could feel tension coiling in her muscles like a spring under pressure. "What kind of forces?" "The church," Mama Brigitte said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Not the local priests who preach to the masses, but the hidden orders, the ones who deal with threats that ordinary faith cannot touch. They've heard of you, child, and they're coming." The old woman reached beneath her counter and withdrew an object that made Mary's blood run cold, a silver cross inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the candlelight. It radiated a power that was the antithesis of everything Mary had become, a force of absolute order that sought to bind and contain the chaos she represented. They call themselves the Order of the Sacred Flame, Mama Brigitte continued. They've been hunting practitioners of the old ways for centuries, and they have methods that, well, let's just say that death would be a mercy compared to what they do to those they capture. Mary stared at the cross, feeling its power like a physical weight pressing down on her. How long do I have? Days, maybe a week. They're already in the city, setting up their base of operations, gathering intelligence. They know about me, about Claude, about everyone who's helped you. This isn't just about stopping you anymore. They want to root out the entire network, to make an example that will discourage others from following your path. The implications hit Mary like a physical blow. She had always known that her actions would have consequences, but she had focused on the immediate threats. The plantation owners, the slave traders, the corrupt officials who profited from human misery. She hadn't considered that her war against the system might draw the attention of forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of society. "What do you advise?" Mary asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Run," Mama Brigitte said simply. "Disappear into the bayous, or better yet, leave the south entirely. Go north, where there are people who will help you, who understand what you're fighting for. Live to fight another day." Mary was quiet for a long moment, considering the old woman's words. The rational part of her mind knew that Mama Brigitte was right, that staying would mean facing enemies she might not be able to defeat, that her death would accomplish nothing except to give her opponents a victory. But another part of her, the part that had been forged in the fires of oppression and tempered by the blood of her enemies, rebelled against the idea of retreat. "No," she said finally, her voice carrying a finality that made the candles flicker. "I won't run. Too many people are counting on me, believing in what I represent. If I disappear now, it will be seen as proof that the old order is stronger than the forces of change." Mama Brigitte sighed, but there was no surprise in her expression. "I knew you would say that, child. Your pride has always been both your greatest strength and your greatest weakness." "It's not pride," Mary replied. "It's responsibility. I started something here, something that's bigger than just me. If I abandon it now, all those who have died will have died for nothing." The old woman nodded slowly, then reached beneath her counter once more. This time she withdrew a small vial filled with a liquid that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Then take this. It's the last gift I can give you, a potion that will enhance your powers beyond anything you've experienced before. But be warned, child. Using it will change you permanently. You'll become something that exists more in the spirit world than in the physical one. You'll have the power to face your enemies, but you'll also lose the last vestiges of your humanity." Mary took the vial, feeling its weight in her palm. The liquid inside seemed to move with a life of its own, and she could sense the vast power it contained. "Will I still be me?" "You'll be what you choose to become," Mama Brigitte said cryptically. "The question is, what are you willing to sacrifice for victory?" As Mary left the shop for what she knew would be the last time, she carried with her not just the vial of transformation, but also the weight of a decision that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of everyone who had believed in her cause. The Order of the Sacred Flame was coming, bringing with them the full power of institutional authority and divine mandate. But they would find that the legend of Mary of New Orleans was not so easily extinguished. In the days that followed, the city held its breath as two ancient forces prepared for a confrontation that would determine the future of the resistance movement. On one side stood the representatives of order and tradition, armed with centuries of experience in hunting down threats to their authority. On the other stood a young woman who had been transformed by suffering into something beyond human understanding, carrying the hopes and dreams of all those who yearned for freedom. The final battle was coming, and when it was over, either the legend of Mary of New Orleans would be written in blood and fire across the pages of history, or it would be buried so deep that future generations would know it only as a whispered tale told in the darkness. But regardless of the outcome, the seeds of change had already been planted. In slave cabins across the South, in the meeting places of abolitionists, in the hearts of all those who had heard her story, the spirit of resistance burned bright. Mary had shown them that the system was not invincible, that even the most powerful oppressors could be brought low by those they sought to control. The summer of 1839 was ending, but the fire that Mary had lit would burn for generations to come. Whether she lived or died, whether she triumphed or fell, the legend of Mary of New Orleans would endure, a reminder that justice, once awakened, could never truly be silenced. And in the bayous and swamplands that surrounded the city, in the spaces between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits, something waited and watched. Something that had once been a frightened slave girl, but had become something far more dangerous, a force of nature, an avatar of vengeance, a promise that the price of oppression would always eventually be paid in full. The legend lived on, and it would continue to live as long as there were those who remembered that sometimes, when all other options have been exhausted, the only response to systematic evil is systematic resistance. Mary of New Orleans had shown them the way, and now it was up to others to follow the path she had carved through blood and shadow toward a future where freedom was more than just a dream whispered in the darkness. The story was ending, but the legend was just beginning.